Leah S. Glaser is professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. Her books include Interpreting Energy at Museums and Historic Sites and Electrifying the Rural American West, Stories of Power, People, and Place. And her work has appeared in numerous journals, including The Public Historian and Western Historical Quarterly.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. For those of you who don't know, I direct the Public History program in the Department of History at Central. And for those of you who don't know, public history is the practice of history outside the classroom. It directly engages the public by enlisting traditional historical inquiry and research alongside skills and collaboration. And public history often tries to address and inform current and future problems. The world's broadly accepted definition of sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And this sentiment strongly resonates with public historians and preservationists' effort to preserve historical resources and interpret history for present publics and future generations. This tree book, which I co-edited with a colleague of mine, who is a professor in Florida, was published last month, but it emerged over the course of a decade, at least. I first began writing about trees when 2 years after the 100-year anniversary of the Connecticut Forest and Park Commission, and on the heels of Hurricane Irene, a highly unusual October 2011 snowstorm brought down the still leafy trees and knocked out electrical power across Connecticut for a week and threw Halloween into chaos. The Hartford, Connecticut headlined, "Connecticut's love of trees threatens electrical service," and Governor Dana Malloy essentially declared the state's war on trees. He says, "We got too many trees alongside the roads that also have wires adjacent to them," he excoriated Connecticut's tree lovers. "We're going to have to do something about that. Mark my word, when we start to do that, there are going to be people wrapping themselves around trees." Most of the general public living without electricity for a week hated the trees by then, and the power company by this point anyway. But the then Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation followed with a warning that tree trimming would impact historic landscapes like the Merritt Parkway, completed in 1940. The history of Connecticut's public conservation of trees as elements of forests and parks in the years prior to 1940 make them, ironically, as much a part of the infrastructure of Connecticut's industrial development as electrical power lines, which I happen to know a lot about, considering the topic of my first book. The governor was not far off in directing his comments to the tree huggers, however. Connecticut was very serious about its trees and had some of the country's foremost experts ensuring the state's commitment to them during the early 20th century, the heyday of industrial development in the state. At one time, conservationist interests very much aligned with those of a state struggling to find its citizens recreational refuge from the 20th century's rapid urbanization and industrial revolution. My favorite superhero, to change gears a little bit, in the Marvel movies that my kids grew up with and insisted on seeing in every theatrical release since this time, 2013, was Groot, a sentient tree that saves the universe by sacrificing himself. But he has the ability to regenerate, and his resilience when his friend replants what is left of him was a metaphor. Over several films, Groot, like earthbound trees, regenerated and continues his heroic activities alongside superhumans to preserve life throughout the universe. Public historians need to tap our superpowers to protect and preserve trees as keepers of our planet, our places, as well as our planet. When we root stories, pun intended, when we root stories and places, we rarely give vegetation the same attention as buildings and structures. Efficient resource management should supplement ecological conservation practices with historical documentation, evaluation, and preservation. The release of carbon through the burning of fossil fuels causes climate change. Trees, though, absorb carbon. They are our best soldier and heroes in this fight. So trees have long been a significant part of the way Americans tell stories about their past. The notion of European colonization hewing a civilization out of an untamed wilderness is so deeply ingrained in our mythology that it has survived countless debunkings. The forest and the wilderness have long been sources of fear and endless possibility in the American imagination. Likewise, logging and forestry are both active economies that some communities commemorate, as well as ways to recall their past. Virtually all historic sites, museums, and parks have trees as part of their charged and curated settings, even if they do very little more than just shade a pathway or a parking lot. But despite trees' ubiquity, there has been little discussion about how they function in and what they bring to historical places. There has been even less scholarship addressing how to manage them as climate change increases deforestation and exacerbates the other problems that damage trees present to historic buildings, landscapes, and archaeological resources. A tree can be an aesthetic part of a historical landscape. It can be a meaningful piece of personal and communal memory. It can be a character in lore. It can be an object of reverence or significant to culture. Viewed this way, trees are often essential participants in the ways humans connect to places and recall their pasts. In his classic 1864 work, Man and Nature, George Perkins Marsh argued that the downfall of ancient civilization had begun with the felling of trees. So if trees can be cultural, personal, and historic resources, as well as natural ones, perhaps we should start treating, preserving, and telling stories about them accordingly. The impact of climate change is demanding a serious and immediate discussion on the intimate, inseparable relationship between trees and people. Historical perspectives might not provide immediate solutions to the climate crisis and all of its related calamities, but it can prevent us from forgetting how knee-jerk responses, forgive me, fail to see the forest through the trees. This volume represents the first effort to understand how trees have functioned and still do work in public historical contexts. The original and contributed essays begin to fill that gap by looking at range of trees and forested places at historical and public history settings across the nation and explain how trees have functioned as conveyors of historical meaning, what the climate crisis means for the future they share with their sites, and how trees have been silent actors in public history. The essays grew out of lots of sessions, as I implied, many organized by myself and my co-editor at various meetings with the National Council on Public History and the work of its Committee on Environmental Sustainability. Each essay focuses on an individual tree, set of trees, or defined forest to explore how trees have been creators and locations of meaning, specific challenges for sites and communities, and objects of curation. While historical and natural resource management practices and policies moved ideas about culture and nature further apart, a distinct separation has proved really problematic. Traditional cultural beliefs and behaviors emerged from traditional practices, most often tied to seasonal changes, climate, and topography. Science has dictated some of the public policy toward trees, but management decisions often seemed more cultural in practice. Although, and perhaps because, the National Historic Preservation Act coincided with the National Environmental Protection Act in the late 1960s, the execution of these laws severed trees from the human landscape. Several recent histories have documented the urban forest, but not in the context of the historic preservation movement. These histories set up context and calls for action in saving, preserving, and managing trees beyond the ecological and public health arguments. But most do not explicitly frame those narratives in ways that might translate to action and policy of a general public. On the applied history side, historic preservationists continue to adhere to traditional guidelines about how and which buildings to preserve, repair, restore, and rebuild, when trees are every bit as critical to maintaining the sense of place as the built environment. In spite of some recent noteworthy scholarship, therefore, public historians and historic preservationists still rarely grant trees the type of attention they need. So this book contains 12 original essays divided into two parts: trees, place, and community, and trees as symbols and interpreted objects. Some discuss individual trees or tree groves, others wider forests. In the first section, Andrew Hurley's essay on memories Recovering Historical Meaning in Neighborhood Trees surveys popular perceptions of trees in historic sections of St. Louis, Missouri, to show how they can be part of revitalizing urban communities in a sustainable fashion. In The Most Useful Tree, Memory Landscape, and the American Chestnut, and as well as essays on hickory and sycamore speak to those specific types of trees, and others speak to very particular trees, as my co-editor's contribution on the cherry tree at the George Washington birth site. Essays talk about trees as economic resources, as witness trees, and as memorials in and of themselves. Essays address the role of trees in community building and trauma, such as lynchings, and the lack of trees in communities historically redlined. My own essay focuses on forest management in Connecticut, as inspired by the story that I began with. And it is organized around major storms that destroyed swaths of trees in the state since colonial times. The trees play a special role in our state, indeed its own origin story, in the hiding place of the colonial charter in an oak tree to retain independence from the crown. The tree remains, this charter oak tree remains revered upon its death. Citizens literally had a funeral for it and created hundreds of scions and countless pieces of furniture out of it. Connecticut is one of the most forested states in the country, and with the most urban tree cover. After the hurricane of 1938, the state's most fervent forest protectors responded quite differently than in 2011. Rather than decide to cut down, they redoubled efforts to plant bigger and stronger trees. Like many areas of the country, Connecticut's designation and management of its forests and parks grew during the progressive era when land managers had very distinct and precise ideas about managing trees and other natural resources in the face of industrial development. Some saw trees as economic resources, and others considered them aesthetic elements essential to one's quality of life. The rise of the automobile and the affordability of fossil fuels shifted economic development and conservation philosophies. Recreation became the central issue in the public management of natural and cultural resources, and ironically, drove these concepts and resources further and further apart, sometimes literally, as people literally drove to these parks and to get out of the city into these places. So how can understanding trees as cultural resources, memorials, and artifacts change how we manage these resources? If we consider that the natural environment is culturally constructed, should natural and historical parks be managed differently? Concerns over the limits of natural resources are returning, and planning for an environmentally sustainable future are again on the upswing. Meanwhile, well, they were on the upswing. Meanwhile, the practice of historic preservation has evolved from saving sacred patriotic spaces and rehabilitating older buildings for economic development to maintaining historic resources as environmentally sustainable places. We can begin to adapt our resource management policies by exploring more explicit ways to discuss the intersection of environment and culture through specific resources. Public historians can help tell these stories, making trees culturally as well as environmentally relevant. Thank you.
Questions? All right. So this all brings to mind what I consider one of the worst books ever written, The Giving Tree, right? Where this lad just hacks up a tree. It's his good friend, and it does all sorts of things for him, and he just keeps hacking away at it. Does that reflect any truth at all in the way things
Yeah,
really
I mean,
have
I
been?
think it's a major metaphor for how we treat trees as so many. There's so many. That book goes through the different aspects of how trees give, whether it's shade or play or memories, and we attach, so many tree stories are attached to people's childhood memories, and then increasingly it becomes an economic resource as we get older, and it becomes something that is then more of a bother, to adults and living in the modern world, as when the trees bring down the power lines. Of course, the trees bring down the power lines because we didn't maintain the trees, not because they're together. Yeah.
Well, the we chose to put the power lines on poles next to trees.
Yeah,
right.
that are made of trees, by the way.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this obviously, so, people's understanding about trees and their value certainly has been around for a long time. And I guess to understand that when we continually look at trees as an economic resource or a utilitarian, it doesn't hit as deep as we can when it gets to people's memories and their own personal connections to trees and trees they literally grew up with, as in the example of the giving tree. The idea is that, how do you make people care, right? You tell these stories and you find a way to connect their own life to, the lives of trees, and most people have those memories. Almost everybody has some connection to some kind of. Abigail.
Can I ask a question about the economic resource side of it? Because I'm thinking of the fact that I'm from Vermont. If I go visit family members, we walk through the forest, and they like to walk through the forest, and they find it like relaxing. They like to be outdoors, and they see this as like a really important cultural thing, that there are all these trees. But they also look at the trees and say, like, my grandfather will do this. He'll be like, "There's this many board feet of." They'll go around estimating,
yeah.
Even if they're not going to cut this particular place. But a big part of their kind of sort of like almost family lore is keeping up these woodlots, and so I'm curious how that plays into this public history, where to some extent there need to be sort of special trees that you tell stories about, but then there's also these like much larger.
Yeah, I mean, and then, so a lot of those essays are on special trees, but several of them, including mine, are about just the role of trees in general. And I do talk about the role of, largely the role of trees. The reason we have a forested state is because of most of the initial foresters were trained in Connecticut. And they saw forests as an economic resource that needed to be managed in order to maintain that building stock and that economic resource. And then people are like, "Oh, but I want to go hiking." So there was this huge battle between, and this happened on a national level and in Connecticut, between the people who wanted recreational parks and people who saw and people who wanted to manage the forest for economic purposes, and and people refusing to see the difference in those purposes. And this is part of kind of this American idea of segmenting and zoning different places for different purposes. And so even today, people fail to see the economic purpose of the Forest Service as opposed to the recreational and preservation purpose of the Park Service, because we've blended them. And I think when we start cutting those managers of the forest, they're not just park rangers like in the Park Service. They're managers of this economic resource. And again, without understanding that history, I think people have a hard time reconciling those two things. We weren't meant initially to use those forests as pure recreation. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that, because the Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly. Yeah, it's an economic resource, but again, we've treated it like a park. We've treated it for recreational purposes. And it was a big fight. Like, it was some great documents between the Yale foresters. There's a state forest and park commission, park association, state forest and park association, that was started by the foresters, and they were forced to add park so that they could continue to manage their forests and not let the park people take over. But in the state, there's a state park and forest commission, Park First, which was the state's priority. And so there was this constant tension between those uses. But that's very astute, and there was a fight whether it would go into the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Interior.
I have another thing kind of on that line, which is the Yale Forestry School has changed its name.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I
Like
mean,
what
I think
that bodes for the future.
well, I think they're
What was it changed to?
it was changed to the sustainability.
School of Environment.
Environment and
Something like that.
sustainability instead of the School of Forestry.
So there's a forestry school now
Within-
within this bigger
yeah.
school. But that was, I just learned about it the other night.
Yeah.
So, yeah, at dinner. with somebody.
Yeah, I think it's a different understanding of managing resources for economic profit versus managing those resources for both economic and environmental sustainability.
I think one of the really interesting things about Connecticut is that, when Europeans first arrive here, they start clear cutting and for agriculture. And now in Connecticut, even though that 2011 storm was, so bad and we started cutting trees, Connecticut's more forest
Yeah.
than it's been since colonists arrived. And one of the elements we get from that is the wildlife has really come back, from bobcats to bears and I think a lot of people read that occurrence backwards. They go, oh, because we're encroaching on their territory, and it's like, well, actually, no, we're letting their territory come back, and so it's just sort of an interesting conundrum of how people see it.
Yeah, and I think it's confusing, right? In that way, you have this. You have people, again, seeing trees in different ways, and when they're confused in this way between as recreational or natural or economic resources, we don't manage them well. And that's kind of what's happened with the trees falling on the power lines. Those trees that we plant are not the same as trees that are part of a forest. And we need to see them as those street trees are cultural resources, but we don't see the difference in those. And so they need to be managed and trimmed and cut in a very different way than we manage like groups of trees and the forest. There's been like all these books about also how forests, are just one entity and they're all connected by roots and, fiction and nonfiction. And there's a lot we still need to learn. But if we don't understand it, then we're not understanding and we're not managing it well.
Did you discuss anywhere in that book about maple syruping, maple sugaring, or anything like that? Did anyone?
Yeah,
get
I'm
it?
trying to think if anybody wrote about maple syrup.
Because the reason I asked
yeah.
about it is actually my husband started doing this a couple years ago, just because I think it connects him to sort of like a French Canadian identity. It's not for commercial purposes or anything. It's just we have access to maple trees, and it sort of makes him feel like he's somehow tapped in, so to speak.
Yeah, for those who have never done an edited volume, I won't do it again because we did recruit a lot of people who ended up dropping out. So I think we're missing a couple of maybe more obvious ones like that. But there's one about silkworms, that in Utah. And so there's and then the chestnuts, for the chestnut tree. So there are other kind of similar stories to that. But I don't know, I know we mentioned maples and maple syrup like in the introduction or the conclusion, but I don't think there's a specific. And then I think it's mentioned in other essays as well, but not specific. An essay specifically on maple syrup.
Leah, you mentioned lynching, and I was also thinking, you've talked largely about the beneficent aspects of trees and forests and our livelihoods, but of course trees are wrapped up with some other more troubling histories. Lynching, you talked about forestry. Okay, so a lot of American foresters trained in Connecticut, but where did they train? They trained in Germany, right? And there has been a lot of work on Boden and, the ways in which forests had this particular racial element for the Nazis. And there's a parallel story in progressive conservation as well, Men as Trees Walking, and these ideas about the relationship, the connections between the conservation movement and eugenics. I'm wondering if are there other examples that you draw out in there, or is any of that story teased out in some of the pieces?
Yeah, regrettably, we don't go, far back to that, but there are kind of remnants of those stories, right? In certainly the we have the association of lynching with trees as places of trauma. We have the lack of trees in places like red line neighborhoods that are then causing heat islands. But then our last actually chapter is about this Olympic tree that was, I guess, during the Olympics in Nazi Germany, they gave them trees with their medals. And one of those Olympic trees was one of, not Jesse Owens, but another gentleman who had won a gold medal. And they planted, that tree is planted in Los Angeles now, and they're planted all over the world. And this artist who lives in Germany now, got really interested in the story of this tree and the preservation of this tree. And so my co-author had seen an article about it in the New York Times, and so the last chapter is kind of an interview with him about this kind of Nazi legacy. So that's an interesting, now we sort of need to it would have been great to pull all that together. That would have been interesting. I'm not, but as an interview format, it doesn't do that.
One of the lines you in your introduction was about when human beings started cutting down trees, it was something, the beginning of civilization, the end of civilization, something like that.
Yeah, that was Marsh's.
And so it struck me because I'm thinking about the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. And of course, the first ship, the Argo, was made out of trees, right? Made out of wood. And even in the ancient world, they viewed Jason and the Argonauts as, on the one hand, heroic, because they're doing something, they're crossing the sea, something that was never done before. At the same time, there was something hubristic about it, insofar as that maybe human beings aren't supposed to be able to cross the seas. And so kind of that tension about, well, what are we doing to our environment? What do we do, are human beings, in just the very act of being heroic, are also kind of crossing boundaries that they shouldn't cross?
I mean, I think it's natural, again, we need to understand that human beings are part of the natural environment, and we're going to use the natural environment, and it just is really the scale in which we use and exploit that natural environment. I think, people have been using trees for building materials for forever, and that this is not to say that we shouldn't. I mean, we need to control trees. They go nuts when you don't manage them. So in order to live with them, you need to understand how they work and what they're for, and manage them accordingly. And so it's not an all or nothing, which is what drives me crazy about the tree cutting policy. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invite.